The rain came sideways that night, the way it only does in West Texas when the land itself seems to be fighting back against something it cannot name. Eli Crane stood in the doorway of his barn with a lantern held low, the flame guttering and spitting against the wet, and he heard her before he saw her, a sound beneath the storm, thin as wire. That stopped him cold in the chest. She was crouched behind the water trough, half submerged in the red mud that had pooled there, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her dark hair plastered across her face like creek moss across a stone. 16, maybe 17 years old. A Comanche girl, unmistakable in the cut of her dress, in the silver beadwork on her moccasins that caught the lantern light like scattered stars. There was a gash along her left forearm, wrapped clumsily with a strip of cloth that had soaked through dark an hour ago, and her breathing came in the shallow, careful way of someone who had been running a very long time. Eli Crane was 43 years old. He had buried a wife. He had buried a son. He had fought at Palo Duro Canyon on the wrong side of history and knew it and carried it the way a man carries a stone in his boot, every single step. He was not a good man in the way hymns describe goodness, but he was a specific kind of honest, and what that honesty told him. Standing there in the drowning rain with the lantern swinging in his hand, was simple. He could not walk back inside and leave her there. "Come on, then," he said, in Comanche, the words clumsy and old in his mouth like coins found in a coat pocket from another decade. He held the lantern out to the side so the light fell on his empty right hand. "Come on." She did not move for a long moment. Then, slowly, like something wild deciding whether the offer of warmth is worth the risk of the hand, she stood. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. Her name was Nayeli, and she said it only once, quietly, as he held the barn door against the wind. She said it the way a person states a fact they are not sure will be accepted, flatly, without ornamentation, watching his face for the reaction. He nodded, said it back, and did not mangle it. That seemed to matter to her, though she did not say so. He brought her into the house through the back, which opened into the kitchen, and the kitchen was a testament to a man living alone for going on 3 years. The table held 2 coffee cups that had not been washed since Tuesday, a coil of rope that had no business being indoors. A Harper's Weekly folded open to a story Eli had stopped reading in the middle weeks ago and never returned to. And a jar of axle grease sitting directly beside a tin of salt as if they had been placed there by a man who no longer noticed the difference between what belonged and what did not. The floor was swept, but only in the middle. The corners held their dust like secrets. Nayeli stood just inside the door and took it all in without expression. Eli pulled out the chair with the least wobble and set it near the stove. He got the fire going. The wood box was down to 3 pieces and some bark, which told him he'd been putting off the splitting again, and then he stood in the middle of his kitchen and tried to remember what a man does when another person is bleeding in his house. He got the tin of lard and the clean cloth he kept folded above the stove. He boiled water. He came to her slowly and held out the cloth and the warm water bowl and did not reach for her arm. She looked at the bowl, then at him, and then she took the cloth herself and began to clean the wound. He watched for a moment to see how bad it was. It was not deep enough to need sewing. It was deep enough to have needed attention an hour ago. He set the lard tin on the chair beside her and went to find the bandaging. While she worked on her arm, he worked on the kitchen. He moved the rope to the hook by the back door. He washed both cups without thinking about it. He opened the lower cabinet and stood there in the half-dark of the firelight looking at what he had, which was half a sack of cornmeal, dried beans in a clay pot with the lid cracked, 3 strips of salt pork wrapped in wax cloth, 2 potatoes with eyes starting to push through the skin, an onion, and a jar of rendered fat. There was also, on the high shelf, a small tin of ground coffee that was down to its last few tablespoons, which he had been rationing like a man rationing morphine. He put the beans on first, knowing they would need time. He cut the salt pork into the cast iron skillet and let it render down slow, and the smell of it, sharp and meaty and almost sweet, filled the kitchen in a way that made the room feel smaller. Warmer. More honest. He diced the onion fine and put it in with the pork fat, and it hissed and went translucent, and the smell changed into something deeper. Something that had to do with warmth and repetition and all the meals that had ever been made in all the houses that ever kept their people alive through hard seasons. He mixed the cornmeal with water and a pinch of salt and pressed it into 4 small rounds that he laid in the skillet after the pork was done. He cut the potatoes into rough quarters and put them straight into the bin pot. It was not elegant food. It was food that asked nothing of anyone and gave everything back. She had finished with her arm and wrapped it neatly, neater than he would have, and she sat watching him cook. He set a plate in front of her without ceremony and poured coffee into one of the clean cups and set that beside it. He sat across from her with his own plate, and they ate in the particular silence of 2 people who have nothing safe to say yet but who are, in the eating itself, saying something essential. She ate with focus and without waste. She tore the cornbread and used it to push the beans against the back of the spoon, and she ate the potato quarters one at a time. Halfway through, she paused and looked at the window, at the rain beating against the glass, and something moved across her face that Eli did not look at directly because it was not his to see. He got up and refilled her coffee without asking. When she finished, she stacked her plate on top of his and set the spoon across them both, which was a kind of order. And then she looked at him across the table with eyes that were dark and exhausted, and still, underneath all of that exhaustion, ferociously alert. "Your wound needs the lard on it or it will close wrong," he said, in English this time, and then in what Comanche he could piece together. She held out her arm. He applied the lard carefully, not touching more of her than the wound required, and he wrapped it with clean cloth and tucked the end under. Then he stood up and went to the small room off the kitchen. It had been his son's room, 3 years empty. The bed still made in the manner of a woman who could not stop making beds even as she was dying, and he pulled back the quilt and turned it back and came out and pointed. Nayeli looked at the room a long time. Then she went in and lay down on top of the quilt with her moccasins still on, her hands folded on her stomach, and she was asleep in the time it took him to bank the fire in the stove. He sat in the kitchen for a while in the dark and listened to the rain and tried not to think about who might be looking for her and what it would mean when they found her here. She was awake before he was. He found her in the pre-dawn dark of the kitchen with the stove going and the coffee on, which startled him more than he wanted to show. She had washed the skillet and set it back in its proper place on the hook beside the stove. She had also, without being asked, refilled the wood box. The back door was still settling on its hinges from where she had brought the wood through. And he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the full wood box and felt something unnameable shift in his chest, quiet and tidal. She poured him coffee without looking at him. He sat down. He drank it. Outside, the rain had stopped and the land was the color of wet clay, all of it pressing flat under a sky the color of an old bruise healing. The barn needed work today. The north fence had a post that had been leaning wrong since the last wind, and he'd been watching it fail slowly. The way you watch things fail when you are living alone and the urgency of maintenance no longer visits you with any force. After breakfast, she followed him to the barn without asking. He did not tell her to leave or tell her to stay. He simply opened the barn door and began, and she positioned herself on the other side of the fence post and took the bracing hold without needing instruction. They worked the post back to plumb, and he set the stones around its base and tamped them down with the flat of the maul, and she held steady the whole time. They worked the fence line west for 2 hours in the cool of the morning. She found a section he hadn't seen where the wire had rusted through at a splice, and she brought it to him wordlessly, holding up the broken end. He had wire in the barn. He went and got it, and she watched him work the splice, and when he handed her the pliers she knew how to use them. At midday they sat in the shade of the mesquite along the west fence and ate the remaining cornbread cold with water from the canteen. A red-tailed hawk made long, slow circles in the white sky above them. The land spread out in every direction, amber and red and brown, the grass burnt down to nothing by August, the caliche showing through in patches like old bone. It was the kind of country that did not comfort, but it was honest in its discomfort, and there was something in that. She spoke for the first time since the night before. "How long have you been here alone?" Her English was clean, careful, the consonants struck like she had learned it as a second language from someone who cared about precision. 3 years, he said. She looked at the fence line. It shows. He almost laughed. Almost. 40 miles southeast, in the Breaks country where the caprock dropped away into red ravines and cedar, a man named Hosa made camp before noon. He was not a man who made camp before noon. Anyone who had ridden with him, fought beside him, or been unlucky enough to ride against him in the years before the reservations knew that Hosa, war chief of the Quahadi band, did not rest until the light was gone, and sometimes not even then. But today he stopped, and he crouched over the mark in the ground that his tracker, a young man named Pio, keen-eyed and thorough, had found at the crossing of the dry creek. Moccasin print. Small. Recent, made in the mud before the rain hit hard enough to blur it, which meant late yesterday evening. Hosa looked at the track a long time. His face was cut from something harder than anger. What lived on it now was something worse, the specific, focused calm of a father who has been tracking his missing daughter for 36 hours and has now, for the first time, something to follow. He stood. He looked north. How many? He asked Pio. 1 track. Only 1. Pio hesitated. And then, another. Heavier. Boots. Hosa was quiet for a full minute. The cedar moved in the dry wind. Somewhere a canyon wren dropped its cascading call down through the silence. We ride north, Hosa said. By evening they were 40 warriors. By the next morning, word had traveled the Breaks in that way it does, rider to rider and fire to fire, and they were 70. Eli went to Gaza's crossing on the 3rd day because he needed salt, lamp oil, and a new roll of wire. The rusted splice they'd found on the fence was only the first one, and because if he didn't go to town on his regular Thursday, people would notice the irregularity of it and come looking, which was worse. He did not intend to bring Nayeli. She decided differently. She came out of the house as he was hitching the grey to the wagon, carrying his coffee cup that he'd forgotten on the porch rail. She handed it to him, then climbed up onto the wagon bench before he could form a thought about it either way. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead at the road in the posture of someone who has already concluded the argument. He got up on the bench and clicked the grey forward and did not say a word about it. Gaza's crossing was not much of a town. It was a general store, a feed lot, a small post office that doubled as the sheriff's office when the sheriff was present, which was irregular, a blacksmith, a church of the Baptist persuasion with a cracked bell, and a saloon that outnumbered the church in attendance every day of the week including Sunday. The population within 5 miles was perhaps 300 souls, most of them ranchers or the remnants of ranchers, people the land had used and not yet finished using. They got the salt first. Harlan Deeds ran the general store in the way some men run things, as though the store were not primarily a commercial enterprise but a throne from which he might observe and judge the traffic of the world. He was a wide man with small eyes set too close together and a mustache he kept waxed into points, which in Eli's experience was a reliable marker of a man who trusted his own opinion too completely. He came around the counter when Eli came in, and his eyes went past Eli immediately, through the open door, to where Nayeli waited on the wagon bench. His expression did the thing it did. A narrowing. A pulling back, as if from an unpleasant smell. "Morning, Eli," he said, without looking at Eli. "Salt, lamp oil, and I need to know if you've got 18-gauge wire in stock." "Got 14-gauge. Deeds moved behind the counter now, slowly. "Who is that?" "Someone staying at my place." "Comanche." "I know what she is, Harlan." Deeds set the salt block on the counter with more force than was necessary for a salt block. "You know there's been talk. 3 ranch hands over at the Ridley place found tracks in the Breaks. Apache, some say. Others say Comanche." He paused, adjusting the salt block by a 1/4 inch, which was not about the salt block. "War party kind of tracks. People see what they are afraid of," Eli said. "People see what's there." Deeds looked at him now, with those small eyes. Now, I'm not saying anything unpleasant, Eli, I'm saying a man in your position, living out there alone, taking in a stray, that is not smart. That is the kind of thing that brings trouble to a man's door. And to his neighbor's doors, which is where I take my objection. Ring up my order. Harlan. I'm just saying, ring it up. There was a silence in the store that had the weight and the texture of a held breath. Then Nayeli came through the door. She had gotten down from the wagon for reasons of her own, and she came into the store and stood in the slant of light from the window, and the room, there were 4 other people in it. A ranch wife and her daughter, and 2 men at the Cracker Barrel, went still in the way that rooms go still when something disrupts the expected order of things. She moved to the shelf with the medicinal goods. She picked up a tin of willow bark. She turned it over and read the label, which visibly surprised Deeds, and then she set it back and picked up a small glass bottle of arnica and examined it. How much? She asked, not looking at Deeds. Deeds stared at her. 15 cents. I will pay 10. That is not how prices work. She set the bottle on the counter beside Eli's salt. 10 cents, she said again, pleasantly. The bottle is older than what is marked. I can see it on the glass. One of the men at the Cracker Barrel made a sound that might have been a laugh, suppressed. Deeds charged her 12 cents. It was the closest he could come to concession without surrendering the principle entirely, and they all understood this. And Nayeli paid it and pocketed the arnica and waited by the door while Eli paid for the rest. Outside, loading the wagon, Eli kept his face turned to the wagon bed. You didn't need to come in, he said. I needed arnica, she said. He didn't answer. After a moment, she said, more quietly, he was going to say more things to you after I came in. He did not. He looked at her then. She was tying down the corner of the top over the wire spool with a knot he recognized as a kind done by someone who has tied things to horses a long time. True enough, he said. But the rest of the town was not Harlan Deeds and therefore was more complicated. On the way out of Garza's Crossing they passed the Baptist church, where Reverend Caudle was replacing a rotted board on the front steps with the slow determination of a righteous man doing physical labor. He stopped when he saw them and put down his hammer and came to the road's edge. Caudle was 60, thin, with a white beard he kept short and eyes that had the unusual quality of being simultaneously kind and shrewd. He had buried Eli's wife. He had read over Eli's son's small grave with dignity and without performance, and Eli had not forgotten it. Eli, he said. He looked at Nayeli. Miss. She looked at him without flinching. She speaks English, Reverend, Eli said. I assumed as much, Caudle said, which was the right thing to say. He looked at Eli. I heard she was with you. I'm not here to speak for Harlan Deeds or anyone like him. I'm here to say, if things become difficult, my door is open. Eli looked at him a long moment. What kind of difficult? Caudle picked up his hammer. The kind that arrives in numbers, he said simply, and went back to his steps. They rode home in the declining afternoon, the sun pressing everything flat and orange and mean. The grey moved at its steady walk, which was the only gait the grey had ever showed interest in, and the land on both sides of the track was empty and enormous and made Eli feel, not for the first time, how thin the idea of a property line was when set against all that space. He had told himself that Caudle's words meant nothing specific, that the Reverend was a man who worried by profession. But he found himself noting, without intending to, the positions of the ridge lines, the places where the road dipped into arroyos and visibility shortened. The way the cedar along the east pasture made a corridor of shadow that ran almost to the barn. That night he loaded both rifles. He didn't explain this. He did it the way he did most things, practically, without announcement, but Nayeli saw it, because she saw most things. And she sat in the chair by the window for a long time after supper looking out at the dark pasture without saying what she was looking at. He was asleep in the front room chair past midnight when the grey started. Not a full alarm, the grey was a phlegmatic animal, not given to drama, but a low, continuous unease, the sound of hooves shifting and restarting on the barn floor. Eli was up before the sound finished forming in his understanding of it. He took the Winchester from beside the door and he went out the back. The night was clear and cold, the moon 3/4 full and throwing everything into silver and deep shadow. He stood against the house wall and let his eyes work. The barn was 40 feet to his left. Beyond the barn, the pasture opened south for 300 yards to the first fence line. He watched the fence line. For a while there was nothing. Then there was a man. He came from the east, along the fence line's shadow, moving slowly and without any of the particular haste of someone who does not expect to be seen. He was Comanche, the movement told Eli that before anything else did, and he was young, and he stopped at the fence and stood there looking at the house. Eli did not raise the rifle. He walked forward, into the moonlight, until he was 30 feet from the fence and visible, and he stopped. He was aware that this was either the right decision or the last one he'd make, and he made it because he knew, had known since the third day, that the option of force would not serve him here. Not tonight. Not in a confrontation where he was one man and the darkness beyond that fence might be holding any number more. The young warrior looked at him. He was perhaps 19, with a rifle of his own across his arms, and his expression was not threatening in the way Eli had prepared for. It was assessing. Eli said, in Comanche, badly, she is safe. She is inside. She is not harmed. The young man was quiet. Her wound is healing, Eli said. She has eaten. A longer quiet. Then the young warrior turned his head slightly and Eli understood that there were others he was reporting to, somewhere in the dark of that fence line. And the understanding of this hit him not as fear, though fear was present, but as a kind of clarity. 70 warriors, Caudle had implied. 70 men in the Breaks country for one girl, which was not a war party. Which was a father. He thought about his own son's grave, for feet long, behind the house. He lowered the rifle to his side completely and stood there open in the moonlight. Tell him, Eli said, to come to the front of the house in the morning. Tell him she will be at the table. Tell him the door will be open. The young warrior looked at him for another long moment. Then he moved back into the shadow of the fence line and was gone. Eli stood in the silver pasture for a time and listened to the night and counted what he had, which was not much, and decided it was enough. He went inside. Naomi was standing in the doorway of the small room, fully awake. I know, she said. Your father, he said. Yes. She sat down at the kitchen table. Her hands were flat on the wood and she looked at them. He will not come to the door. I think he might. She looked up. He sent a scout to look, Eli said. A man who wants to destroy something does not send a scout to look. He sends fire. He sat down across from her. He sent someone to see what was here. She was quiet for a long time. He is a proud man. All fathers are. That's not an obstacle. That's a door. She looked at him with something in her face that was complicated and was not going to simplify. Why are you doing this? She asked. Not suspiciously. With genuine, pressing need to understand. He thought about his answer for long enough that the honesty of it had time to come up through the other things. I had a son, he said. He was 8. The fever took him. He paused. Before that I did things in this country I cannot undo. I cannot fix what I broke. But I can decide what I do with the next thing that comes to my door in the rain. He looked at his hands. That's all this is. She looked at him a long time. That is not a small thing, she said. No, he agreed. I suppose it isn't. He banked the stove and she went back to the small room and he sat up the rest of the night in the chair by the door with the Winchester across his knees, and in the morning the sun came up the color of hammered brass over the eastern Caliche flats and he went and put the coffee on. Hosa came to the front of the house. He came alone, which was the proudest and most dangerous thing he could do, and which Eli recognized for both of those things. He left the 70 warriors. Eli could see the edge of them now, in the morning light, at the fence line and along the cedar break. Quiet and still as the land itself, and he walked up the wagon track to the front porch and stopped. He was perhaps 50 years old. He was not a large man in the way of size, but he was large in the way that certain men are, carrying themselves as if they have been compressed and the compression has made them denser than ordinary matter. His face was a record of a long and difficult life worn with the specific dignity of a man who has refused to be reduced by any of it. He wore no paint. This was deliberate. He had come as a father, not as a war chief, and the distinction was absolute. Eli opened the front door and stood in the doorway. He held nothing in his hands. Hosa looked at him. He said something in Comanche that Eli mostly caught, something about the house. About whose house? Mine, Eli said. My land. My house. Your daughter came here in the rain, wounded and alone. She is inside. She is well. Hosa looked at the house, at its rough adobe and its new window glass and its swept porch, at the barn beyond, at the fence line that ran straight and recently repaired to the west. He looked at all of it for a long time, reading it the way a man reads land that tells him something about the person who works it. Then Nayeli came out of the house. She stood beside Eli, not behind him, and she looked at her father, and her face was doing something complex and enormous that she was managing with great discipline. She said something in Comanche, in a low and steady voice, that went on for nearly a minute. Eli caught pieces of it: the canyon, the men who had driven her from the horse, the running, the rain, the barn, the meal, the fence work. She was telling him. Not appealing. Reporting. Hosa listened without moving. When she finished, there was a silence that had the weight of weather. Then Reverend Caudle's wagon came up the track. Eli had not sent for him. He would find out later that Caudle had been awake since before dawn, watching from the ridge road, and had made his own decision about when to arrive. He came in with the unhurried manner of a man who has prayed about the approach and is therefore not afraid of the destination. He tied his horse at the porch post and came up with his Bible under his arm, not because he intended to use it as a weapon, but because it was where he carried it. The way a carpenter carries a level. He looked at Hosa and said, in adequate Comanche, Eli had not known the Reverend spoke it, but he should have guessed, I am the man of God for this place. I have known this man, he indicated Eli, for 14 years. He is not always wise. But he has never been cruel, and he has never been dishonest, and those are not common things in this country or any other. Hosa looked at Caudle. Your daughter is here, Caudle continued. She is here because a man saw someone hurt and alone and brought her in from the rain. What you do with that is your choosing. But I want to put a thing before you, Chief, because it is a thing I believe is right and because I think you are a man who can hear it. He looked at Eli. Eli. There is a thing we talked about 2 years ago. After your wife. About this land. Eli looked at him steadily. Say it. Your wife's name was on this deed alongside yours. When she died, her share passed to you. But you have no heir. When you go, this land, 140 acres of it, goes to the county, to be sold. And whoever buys it to fence Comanche off it the way every other acre in this territory is being fenced. He paused. Or. He left the oar standing in the air. Eli knew where this was going. He had thought about it himself in the sleepless hours of the night before, which told him it had been waiting in him longer than that night. Or, he said, a man could put another name on a deed. Caudle nodded. Hosa was watching this exchange with the absolute attention of a man who understands more than the words convey. Nayeli said something to her father, quietly, and he answered and she answered him, and the exchange went on in that quiet Comanche for a time. And Eli stood on his porch and felt the morning light move across him and did not try to follow all of it. What happened in the following 2 weeks was not simple, but it was real, which is the only thing that matters about the things that happen. Eli Crane rode to the county seat at Adobe Wells and filed a new deed, adding Nayeli's name to the property, not as a concession, not as a legal maneuver dressed up in sentiment, but as the straightforward naming of a person who had come to a fence line and helped hold it straight and who had more right to this ground than the county ever would. Caudle witnessed it and signed his name in his careful, upright hand. Harlan Deeds heard about it within 4 days, as Harlan Deeds heard about everything, and he made the noise he was always going to make about it, which was considerable and ultimately about as useful as noise generally is. 3 ranchers in the valley signed a letter of objection. 2 others, old Silas Pemberton, who had been in this country since before the Mexican War and who had his own accounting to settle with history, and a German woman named Martha Schrader who ran 100 head alone and did not ask anyone's opinion on how, signed a different letter. Caudle posted it on the church door. Hosa returned to the Breaks country, which was where his people were and where they would remain, pressed and diminished by forces that this deed on one adobe house could not address and never pretended to. But he had done something before he went. He had stood in Eli's kitchen, the same kitchen where his daughter had been given coffee and salt pork and cornbread in the rain, and he had sat at the table and looked at the room, at the full wood box and the clean cups and the coil of wire replaced on its proper hook, and he had said, in English that came from some older place in his history, "She is known here." It was not permission. He did not have the kind of authority that framed itself as permission for another person's life. But it was acknowledgement, which is different and in some ways greater. Nayeli stayed through the winter. She repaired the front window latch that had been broken since the summer before Eli's wife died. He did not know she knew it was broken until he came in one morning and found it done. She brought order to the corners of rooms, the ones Eli had let go. She taught him more Comanche and was patient with his failures and merciless with his pronunciation in a way that was, he recognized, a form of respect. She began to speak about her plans in a way that made clear she was building something, not resting from something. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a camp and a home. In April, when the grass came back green and improbable on the flats east of the barn, she planted a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house. Squash and beans and the small red peppers that grew well in the caliche if you amended the soil with composted manure, which she knew how to do and which Eli did not. He watched her work and he recognized in it the particular quality of a person planting something they intend to be there to harvest. The town of Gaza's Crossing did not become welcoming in any wholesale way. Small towns rarely do anything wholesale, good or bad. What happened instead was the slow and irregular and entirely human process of people adjusting their map of the world by individual, private degrees. The ranch wife who had been in the store that day, her name was Cora Whitfield. And she had 4 children and a husband with a bad leg who could no longer work the upper pasture, began to nod at Nayeli on the road. Then to speak. Then, one afternoon in May, to stop the wagon and ask, without preamble, if it was true what she'd heard, that the girl knew something about remedies for fever in children. It was true. It was also the beginning of something. There is a thing that happens to land that has been through drought. The surface hardens and cracks and the dust blows from it in curtains, and anyone looking at it would say, nothing will grow there again. The land looks finished. The land looks like a conclusion. But underneath, where no one can see it, the roots are still holding. Eli Crane's 140 acres had been, for 3 years, the kind of place where a man goes to be left alone with his grief and his mistakes, and it had obliged him. It had offered him solitude in generous, terrible quantities. It had not offered him repair, because repair is not something the land provides. Repair is what the living do for each other. She came in from the rain with a wound on her arm and moccasins caked in red clay, and she fixed his window latch and filled his wood box and held his fence post straight without being asked. And she planted things along the south wall that she intended to harvest. He had thought he was sheltering her. He had not yet understood that she was also sheltering him. The broken places do not always stay broken. Sometimes what they need is a season of care and one person willing to plant something in the hard ground, willing to believe, against all the evidence of drought, that the root is still there. It is always still there. This was that kind of story. And those, if you pay attention, are the only kind worth telling.